And so we begin chapter 2 of Acts. Now, I spent about 5 weeks going through chapter 1, and it was only 26 verses. And I've decided I'm going to have to pick up the pace or I'm going to go crazy. I'm not a verse by verse kind of person. It's not my personality. I'm a big picture person. So I'm going to do it, I think, at least, my goal is to do about a chapter of Acts a month. Even that, is 28 months, which is over 2 years. So I'm going to do a little over 2 verses a day, I think, in Acts 2. And I should be able to get through the book of Acts well within this month the next month. Okay, so today we begin chapter 2. This is exciting. Acts chapter 2, in my reading of Acts, I think Luke wants us to see Acts 2 as the birth of the church. Now, we have a little discrepancy here. Didn't the church begin when Jesus rose from the dead? Yeah, sure, that's true. But I really believe that Acts wants us to think of the day of Pentecost as the paradigmatic birth of the church, because this is when the Holy Spirit comes. And as I've suggested, I think in a previous video, in the world of Luke Acts, this is the fulfillment of what John the Baptist says in Luke 3. Luke 3 says, I baptize with water, but he will baptize with the Holy Spirit. And so in the narrative world of Luke Acts, the Holy Spirit has not yet come. None of the disciples have received the Holy Spirit in the world of Luke Acts. Now, I know there's that kind of Johannine Pentecost where Jesus says, receive the Holy Spirit, and he breathes on them. That might be John's version of Pentecost, maybe. But in the world of Luke Acts, the disciples have not yet received the Holy Spirit. In a sense, they're not yet Christians. Okay, we'll talk about that as we go through, probably in the scholar portion of these things. I'll get to that at some point. Well, let's dive into Acts 2, 1 through 12, I believe we're going to do today. So, and when the day of Pentecost was fulfilled, all were together into the same. Now, since it fills the whole house, they're apparently, I think Acts wants us to see them in this upper room that they were praying in chapter 1 of Acts. So this upper room in Jerusalem, wherever it is, there is a place called the Cenacle, I'm not sure I forget how they say it. That part of Jerusalem was pretty heavily burned. So that room, unfortunately, probably isn't exactly the room that was there before. Maybe they rebuilt it. Day of Pentecost is, of course, 50 days after the day after Passover and after Easter. And so it's the Feast of Weeks. It's a harvest feast in ancient Israel. And in some Jewish traditions, the day of Pentecost was equated with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. More on that in a second. Okay, so the day of Pentecost is fulfilled. They're all together in the same. A noise comes from heaven. The sound is of a rushing strong wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Now, of course, you may know that both in Hebrew and in Greek, the word for spirit is related to the word for wind. In the Old Testament, ruach is the word for spirit, but it's also the word for a breeze or for a wind. It's difficult for me to know how to translate Genesis 1, 2 that talks about a wind of God blowing across the waters, or is it the Spirit of God? Maybe it's both. But this, and in Greek, it's the same way. The Greek word for spirit is pneuma, which is related to the word for breath and for wind. And so this wind symbolizes the Holy Spirit, it would seem. And that this sound fills the whole house where they were sitting. And divided tongues of fire appeared upon them and sat on each one of them. Now, I believe that Philo, in his treatment of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, talks about fire in this kind of a manner. And so, again, that might relate to the giving of the law at Sinai. The giving of the law at Mount Sinai was the first covenant, and now we have the second new covenant coming at the day of Pentecost. It may be that Luke wants us to see this as correlating with Mount Sinai. Now we have the fulfillment of the law. We have the new covenant coming down on the day of Pentecost. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in different tongues, just as the Spirit was giving them to speak. Now, being filled with the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts, this is a little controversial in Wesleyan and some Pentecostal circles. But as we go through these passages, I'm going to argue that the filling with the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts is, one, it's a repeatable experience. So the disciples will be filled with the Holy Spirit another time. I believe it's in Acts chapter 4. But in the book of Acts, being filled with the Holy Spirit seems to be regularly associated with coming to Christ. So that the Gentiles come to Christ and they're filled with the Holy Spirit. Some people in Samaria believe they've been baptized, and it seems to be a problem if they haven't received the Holy Spirit. Peter and John come up, lay hands on them, then they receive the Holy Spirit. Paul, when he becomes a Christian, receives the Holy Spirit. And so I did a study on this, and of course many others have done a study on this. Some Google Scholar or some Scholar video I make these next days. I'll talk about some of the books, the classic research on this. And so being filled with the Holy Spirit would seem to be a initiatory kind of experience, even though it can be repeated more than once. And so this is the inauguration of the church. This is the disciples being fully becoming Christians, as it were. Now the tongues don't happen every time the Spirit comes. So like in Samaria, it doesn't mention them speaking in tongues when the Spirit comes on them in Samaria. In Acts 9, when Paul receives the Holy Spirit, it doesn't mention him speaking in tongues. So the book of Acts does not clearly associate tongues with being filled with the Holy Spirit every time. The tongues here, as I'm going to argue, seem to be related to languages. Let's keep going. There were Jews dwelling in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when the sound came, the multitude came together and was confused because each one was hearing them speaking in their own language. And so tongues here would seem to be human languages. As we'll see in the next page, some of the kinds of tongues that were given. Now, 1 Corinthians 14, in my reading of 1 Corinthians 14, does not seem to be human languages. I probably will talk about tongues a little bit in my Scholar video for patrons on Saturday. So they were amazed and they were marveling, saying, "Behold, are these not Galileans? And yet we're hearing our own native languages. What's going on here?" Now, what was that? I was going to say something about, so somehow this was so loud that people outside the house must have heard it. And we also should assume that the disciples came out of the house and began to speak in these tongues out in the street, and that the people began to hear him. There was a professor once at IWU where I teach a long time ago, Charles Carter, I think it was, who argued that they were speaking ecstatic prayer languages, but all of the people from these different countries were given the gift of interpretation. That's pretty clever. I don't know if he came up with that, but of course that goes way beyond what Acts says. That requires a little hocus pocus ingenuity. Maybe it's true, but the most straightforward reading of Acts 2 here is that they are given the gift to speak in the languages of these people. How are we hearing in each in our own languages? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, oh my. Parthians are, of course, in the Far East. That would be out, I think, like Iran kind of area. Medes would be maybe even further, way out there, Pakistan maybe. Elamites, ones living in Mesopotamia, so that would be like Babylon. Judeans, I think Judeans is the right translation of the word here. It's the same word for Jews in verse 11, but it seems to me that here, Judean, we'll talk about these when we do the Greek each day. Cappadocians, that's from Turkey, eastern Turkey. Pontus, northern Turkey. Asia, western Turkey, like Ephesus. Phrygia and Pamphylia, that's kind of in the middle south of Turkey. Egypt and parts of Libya around Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross. And Romans who are visiting, both Jews and proselytes. So both people who are part of the diaspora, the scattered Jews, and people in the diaspora who have converted to Judaism, which was a thing. Again, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later on. Cretans and Arabs, I assume these are Jewish converts or Jewish diaspora. These are not Gentiles, I don't believe. We're hearing them speaking the great things of God in our languages. And all were amazed and were perplexed, one and another, saying, "What could this be?" And there were others mocking, saying, "These guys are drunk." So again, we are reminded that those who have ears to hear, hear, and those who don't, don't. Well, this has been an overview of 2:1 through 13 as we start Acts chapter 2.